Lonely mountain man buys obese 19-year-old at auction, marries her that same day. A dusty street, the clang of a church bell, men laughing cruelly as a young woman is shoved onto the block like cattle. Her father calls her worthless. The crowd jeers. Then, boots scrape, spurs jingle. A mountain man steps forward. $1 silver silences the mob. But when the sheriff demands protection for her, the man does the unthinkable, marches her straight to the preacher, binding her to him before God. It seems like salvation, until whispers spread of hidden papers sewn into her quilt, papers that grant her power over the valley's most precious treasure, its water. Suddenly, dangerous men close in, debts rise from the grave, and her new husband is thrown in jail. Now, this once mocked young woman must stand before the town that ridiculed her and prove her worth, not just as a wife, but as the keeper of a legacy others would kill to control. But can love and faith turn a $1 marriage into the salvation of an entire valley? Or will the past's cruelty destroy them both? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The hot afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Millers Creek, Colorado, beating down on the dusty main street where a crowd had gathered for what they called an auction. Sarah Beth Hawkins stood on the wooden platform, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. The rough planks beneath her feet seemed to sway as jeers and cruel laughter rose from the assembled townsmen. "Look what we got here, boys!" the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying over the murmurs and snickers. 19 years old, knows her letters, and can cook well enough, though seems she samples too much of her own fare. More laughter followed his tasteless joke. Sarah Beth fought to keep her chin up, though her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She'd known ridicule before, the whispers behind hands, the sidelong glances, but never this public display of cruelty. Her father stood off to the side, swaying slightly, a half-empty bottle dangling from his fingers. His words from earlier still stung. "Too fat to feed. Might as well get something for her before she eats me out of house and home." The crowd's taunts grew louder, and Sarah Beth blinked rapidly, determined not to cry. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. "Stand tall, child. Your worth comes from the Lord above, not the judgment of men." But oh, how hard it was to remember that now, with dozens of mocking faces turned up toward her. At the edge of the crowd, Elias Turner stood silent, his broad shoulders tense beneath his worn buckskin jacket. He'd come to town for supplies, not expecting to witness such a spectacle. The sight of the young woman's dignity in the face of such cruelty stirred something in him. Memories of his Caroline, perhaps, and her quiet strength before she'd been taken by fever 3 years past. "Who'll start the bidding?" the auctioneer called out, gesturing dramatically. "Surely someone needs a cook, even one with such a hearty appetite." His words drew more cruel laughter, but no bids. Sarah Beth's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her head high, even as tears threatened. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by scattered coughs and muttered jokes. "Not even 2 bits?" the auctioneer pressed, his showman's smile beginning to fade. "Comes with basic reading and writing if that sweetens the deal." More silence. Sarah Beth's father cursed and took another swig from his bottle. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a clear voice rang out. $1 silver. The crowd parted, turning to stare at Elias Turner. He stood straight and tall, his weather-worn face set in determined lines. A few snickers started up. Everyone knew the mountain man lived alone up in the high country, barely coming to town, except for necessities. $1 silver? The auctioneer repeated, eyebrows raised. "Why, It's more than you've got so far," Elias cut in, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. He reached into his pocket and held up the coin, letting it catch the sunlight. The crowd erupted in laughter, but Elias didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Sarah Beth, seeing past the fear and humiliation to something deeper, a quiet strength that reminded him so much of Caroline it made his chest ache. "Going once," the auctioneer called, looking around the crowd hopefully for a competing bid. None came, just more laughter and crude comments. "Going twice." Sarah Beth hardly dared breathe, her eyes fixed on the tall stranger who had offered to buy her. His face was weathered but kind, his stance steady as a mountain pine. "Sold!" the gavel cracked down. "To Elias Turner for $1 silver." The crowd's amusement reached new heights as Elias strode forward, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. He climbed the few steps to the platform and offered Sarah Beth his arm with simple dignity, as if they were at a church social instead of a mockery of an auction. "Much obliged, miss," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Sarah Beth placed her trembling hand on his arm, grateful for its steadiness. As they descended the steps together, her father's voice rose above the crowd's noise. "She ain't worth feeding," he shouted, whiskey slurring his words. "You'll see! Worthless girl just like her mother." Elias felt Sarah Beth flinch but didn't break stride. He led her through the parting crowd, his silver dollar glinting as he pressed it into the auctioneer's outstretched palm. Some of the onlookers had the grace to look ashamed now, dropping their eyes as the pair passed. They walked in silence until they reached the shade of the general store's awning. Only then did Elias turn to face her properly, keeping a respectful distance. "Miss Hawkins," he said carefully, "I know this ain't proper, but I reckon it's better than what was happening back there." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I've got a cabin up in the high country. It ain't much, but it's solid and warm. If you're willing, I'd offer you marriage. Proper and legal, before the circuit preacher comes through next week. If not, I'll see you safely to your kin in the next town over." Sarah Beth studied his face, finding nothing but honest concern there. Her heart was still racing, but something in his steady presence helped her find her voice. "You don't know me, Mr. Turner," she said softly. "Why would you do this?" Elias glanced back toward the auction block, where the crowd was beginning to disperse. "Because no person deserves to be treated like that," he said simply. "My late wife, she taught me about dignity, about seeing people the way the good Lord sees them." Sarah Beth's eyes widened slightly at the mention of a late wife, but before she could respond, her father's voice rang out again. "Hey, mountain man!" The drunk man staggered toward them, bottle still in hand. "You can have her, but don't come crying when she eats you out of house and home." Elias shifted slightly, placing himself between Sarah Beth and her approaching father. "Mr. Hawkins," he said firmly, "I believe our business is concluded." "Just you wait," Hawkins sneered. "Worthless girl, just like—" "That's enough." Elias's voice was quiet, but carried such authority that Hawkins actually stumbled to a stop. "The deal's done. Good day to you, sir." He turned back to Sarah Beth, whose face had gone pale but whose spine was straight as a rail. "Miss Hawkins, what's your decision?" Sarah Beth looked past Elias to her father, who had already turned away to stumble toward the saloon. Then she looked up at the tall mountain man who had offered her a choice, the first real choice she'd had in longer than she could remember. "I accept your offer of marriage, Mr. Turner," she said clearly, though her voice shook slightly. "And I thank you for it." Elias nodded solemnly. "Then let's get you some supplies before we head up to the cabin. There's plenty of daylight left for traveling." They entered the general store together, leaving the heat and humiliation of the afternoon behind them. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Miller, hurried forward with genuine concern on her face. "Oh, child," she said softly to Sarah Beth, "let me help you gather what you need." She shot Elias an approving look before leading Sarah Beth toward the dry goods. As Elias stood by the counter, listing supplies they'd need, he watched Sarah Beth with Mrs. Miller. The girl, no, young woman, moved with a grace that belied the cruel words that had been thrown at her. She held herself with dignity, despite everything that had happened. He remembered Caroline's words from long ago. "The Lord often works in ways we don't expect, Elias. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges." The afternoon sun continued its arc across the sky as they gathered supplies, proper clothes for mountain weather, basic tools, and foodstuffs. Sarah Beth had nothing but the dress she wore and a small bundle containing a carefully wrapped quilt that she kept close. When they finally stepped out of the store, the street had returned to its normal quiet. The auction block stood empty, the only evidence of the earlier spectacle being a few scattered handbills blowing in the dusty breeze. "It's a fair piece up to the cabin," Elias said as he secured their supplies to his pack horse. "But the view of the valley makes it worth the climb." He helped Sarah Beth mount his gentle mare, making sure she was settled comfortably before taking the reins to lead them out of town. As they passed the last buildings of Miller's Creek, Sarah Beth didn't look back. Instead, she kept her eyes on the mountains ahead, their peaks standing proud against the afternoon sky. Whatever waited for her there had to be better than what she was leaving behind. Sheriff Abner Doyle's boots clattered on the wooden sidewalk as he strode toward them, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. His weathered face wore a scowl that deepened the lines around his mouth. "Now hold on here, Turner," he called out, one hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Can't let you just ride off with the girl like this." Elias turned slowly, keeping himself between Sarah Beth and the approaching lawman. The crowd that had begun to disperse now gathered again, sensing more entertainment to come. "Bought and paid for, Sheriff," Elias said evenly. "Fair and square." The sheriff's laugh held no humor. "That ain't how it works, and you know it. This ain't cattle we're talking about. Girl needs proper protection under the law." He looked past Elias to Sarah Beth, his expression a mixture of concern and condescension. Who knows what might happen to her up in them mountains, all alone with a man? The crowd stirred, and someone called out, "Might be worse shame coming than what she's seen today." Crude laughter rippled through the onlookers. Sarah Beth's face burned, but she kept her chin up, one hand clutching the bundle containing her mother's quilt. Elias's jaw tightened. Without taking his eyes off the sheriff, he spoke clearly so all could hear. "You're right about one thing, Sheriff. This ain't about buying property." He turned to Sarah Beth, his voice gentling. "Miss Hawkins, if you're willing, I'd like to make this proper, right here, right now." Sarah Beth's eyes widened as his meaning became clear. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "The church is open." All heads turned to see Reverend Cole standing in the doorway of the small white chapel, his thin frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon light. The circuit preacher's face was grave as he looked from Elias to Sarah Beth. "Though I'd have words with you both first," the Reverend added firmly. Elias nodded. "That's fair." He offered his arm to Sarah Beth. "Miss?" After only a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand on his arm. Together they walked toward the church, past the sheriff who stood scowling, and through the parting crowd. Whispers and snickers followed them, but Elias kept his pace steady and dignified. Inside the cool darkness of the church, Reverend Cole led them to his small office. Dusty sunlight filtered through the single window, falling across his worn desk and the Bible that lay open upon it. "Sit, please," he gestured to the two straight-backed chairs. When they were settled, he leaned against his desk, studying them both. "Marriage is no light matter to be entered into hastily," he began. "It's a sacred covenant before God." "Yes, sir," Elias agreed quietly. "I understand that well." The preacher's eyes softened slightly. "I know you do, Elias. I buried Caroline myself, God rest her soul." He turned his attention to Sarah Beth. "But child, you don't know this man. Marriage should be entered into with joy and certainty, not desperation." Sarah Beth sat very straight in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Reverend," she said softly but clearly. "Today I've been treated like property to be sold. Mr. Turner is offering me the protection of his name and home. That seems more like God's mercy than desperation to me." Reverend Cole's eyebrows rose slightly at her words. He looked at Elias. "And your intentions, sir?" Elias met the preacher's gaze steadily. "Better a wife than property," he said simply. "I can offer her a good home, honest work, and respect. More than she's had here, seems to me." The old preacher was quiet for a long moment, looking between them. Finally, he sighed. "Very well. But I'll need witnesses. Proper ones, not that mob out there." "Mrs. Miller from the store," Sarah Beth suggested quickly. "She was kind to me earlier." "And Tom Jenkins," Elias added. "He's an honest man." Reverend Cole nodded. "I'll send for them. Meanwhile, you can both reflect on the seriousness of what you're undertaking." He left them alone in the office, closing the door quietly behind him. In the silence that followed, Sarah Beth snuck a glance at her soon-to-be husband. Elias sat quietly, his big hands resting on his knees, his face thoughtful but calm. After a moment, he turned to meet her gaze. "You can still say no," he said gently. "I meant what I said about helping you get to your kin in the next town." Sarah Beth shook her head. "I have no kin who'd take me in," she admitted. "And," she hesitated, then continued softly, "you've shown me more kindness in the past hour than I've known in years." Before Elias could respond, the door opened. Mrs. Miller hurried in, her kind face concerned. Behind her came Tom Jenkins, the livery stable owner, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best coat hastily pulled on over his work clothes. Reverend Cole followed them, carrying his Bible and wearing his formal stole. "Shall we begin?" the preacher asked. They stood before the altar, Sarah Beth's hand trembling slightly as Elias helped her to her feet. The late afternoon sun streamed through the church's windows, painting everything in rich amber light. Outside, they could hear the crowd gathering, their shadows moving across the colored glass. Reverend Cole's voice filled the small church with familiar words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God." Sarah Beth felt almost dizzy with the unreality of it all. Just hours ago, she had stood on the auction block, facing humiliation. Now she stood before God's altar, about to become a wife. She snuck another glance at Elias. His face was solemn as he listened to the preacher's words, but when he felt her looking, he turned slightly and gave her a reassuring smile. When it came time for the vows, Elias's voice was clear and steady. Sarah Beth's own voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke the ancient promises. Mrs. Miller sniffled quietly in the background, and even Tom Jenkins looked moved. "The ring?" Reverend Cole prompted. There was a moment of awkward silence before Mrs. Miller stepped forward, slipping a plain gold band from her own finger. "Here," she said softly. "My mother's ring. I want you to have it, child." Sarah Beth's eyes filled with tears as Elias took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but she curled her hand tight to keep it safe. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Cole pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words had barely faded when the church door burst open. Sheriff Doyle stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. "Well," he said gruffly, "I reckon that settles that." He touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Turner." Sarah Beth straightened at her new name, lifting her chin. Elias's hand found hers, warm and steady. They signed the church register, Sarah Beth carefully writing her new name for the first time. Sarah Beth Turner. As they stepped out of the church, the crowd's mockery had turned to something like awe. No one spoke as Elias helped Sarah Beth mount his gentle mule, making sure she was secure before gathering the reins of his pack horse. The sun was setting as they rode slowly out of town, painting the mountains ahead in purple and gold. Sarah Beth clutched her precious bundle, feeling the familiar weight of her mother's quilt inside. The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, and she marveled at how much had changed in a single afternoon. Behind them, the town grew quiet. Ahead, the mountain trail wound upward toward Elias's cabin, toward her new home. Sarah Beth felt a curious mixture of bewilderment and peace. She didn't know what waited for her in the high country, but she knew one thing: she was safe. Elias walked beside the mule, one hand steady on the reins, his stride sure and unhurried. The familiar sounds of his boots on the trail and the gentle jingling of the horse's tack filled the gathering dusk. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the evening songs of birds and the whisper of wind in the pines. The mountain air grew crisp as twilight settled over the trail. Sarah Beth shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her whole body ached from hours in the saddle, muscles she'd never known she had protesting with every step of the mule beneath her. Elias glanced up at her, his eyes catching the last light. "There's a good spot just ahead," he said quietly, "protected from the wind, with water nearby." True to his word, he soon led them into a small grove of pines. The trees formed a natural windbreak, their branches creating a ceiling of needles overhead. A tiny stream trickled nearby, its gentle sound mixing with the evening crickets. "Whoa there," Elias murmured to the mule, helping Sarah Beth dismount. Her legs nearly buckled as she touched the ground, and she grabbed the saddle to steady herself. If Elias noticed, he was kind enough not to mention it. "Best stretch those legs a bit," he suggested instead, already gathering dry branches for a fire. "Walking helps with the soreness." Sarah Beth took a few tentative steps, wincing. The grove was peaceful, though, and she found herself breathing easier away from the town's hostile stares. She watched as Elias efficiently set up their camp, his movements sure and practiced. Soon a small fire crackled between them, pushing back the gathering darkness. Elias rummaged in his saddlebags and pulled out a cloth-wrapped package. "It ain't much," he said, offering her some jerky and a chunk of bread, "but it'll keep us going till we reach home." The word home caught in Sarah Beth's chest. She accepted the food with murmured thanks, trying not to think about how strange it was to be sharing a meal with this man who was now, somehow, her husband. "I'm much obliged," she said softly, after taking a careful bite. "For your kindness today, I mean. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Elias interrupted gently. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "No person deserves to be treated like that." They ate in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. When it came time to sleep, Elias laid out his bedroll on the far side of the fire, making it clear he meant to give her space. Sarah Beth wrapped herself in her mother's quilt, the familiar fabric offering some comfort in this strange new world. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by unfamiliar night sounds and the hard ground beneath her. Each time she opened her eyes, she could see Elias's solid form across the fire. Either sleeping or keeping watch, she couldn't tell which. Dawn came with a chill mist clinging to the ground. Sarah Beth woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the soft sounds of Elias moving around the camp. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting the movement. "Morning," Elias greeted, offering her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Sleep all right?" "Well enough, thank you," she replied, though in truth she felt as if she'd barely slept at all. She began carefully folding her mother's quilt, smoothing each crease with reverent hands. "That's fine work," Elias commented, nodding at the quilt. "The pattern, I mean." Sarah Beth's fingers traced the familiar design. "My mother made it," she said softly, "before she passed." Elias nodded, understanding in his eyes. They broke camp efficiently, though Sarah Beth felt clumsy and slow compared to his practiced movements. The second day's travel was notably slower than the first. The trail wound higher into the mountains, and Elias stopped often to let both Sarah Beth and the animals rest. Mid-morning found them at a wide creek, its waters running swift with mountain snowmelt. Elias studied the crossing carefully before leading them to a wider, shallower section. "Hold tight to the saddle," he instructed, leading the mule into the water. "Old Betty here knows her way, but the stones can be slippery." Sarah Beth gripped the saddle horn as the mule picked her way across. The water swirled around Betty's legs, but the animal remained steady. Elias stayed close, one hand on the bridle, until they reached the other bank safely. During their noon rest, Elias began telling her about his cabin in the high country. "It ain't fancy," he warned, "but it's solid. Got a good roof, tight walls. There's a garden plot that could use tending if you've a mind for it. And the view." He smiled slightly. "Well, that's something you'll have to see for yourself." Sarah Beth listened, trying to picture this place that was to be her home. Fear crept in as she realized how different it would be from town life. I'm afraid I won't be much help," she admitted in a small voice. "I don't know anything about mountain living." Elias turned to her, his face serious. "I didn't marry you for work, Sarah Beth," he said firmly. "I married you to spare you shame. Anything you learn or choose to do is up to you. You'll have time to adjust." The simple honesty in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She looked away quickly, but not before she saw the concern on his face. "Thank you," she whispered. They traveled until dusk, when Elias found them another camping spot, this time in a clearing ringed by tall pines. The sky opened up above them, a tapestry of stars appearing as darkness fell. Sarah Beth sat wrapped in her quilt, looking up at the vast expanse of sky. She'd never seen so many stars. In town, the lamplight had always dimmed them. Here, they seemed close enough to touch. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Elias said softly, settling on his side of the fire. "Never gets old, no matter how many times you see it." "It makes me feel very small," Sarah Beth admitted. "Reckon that's not always a bad thing." He studied the flames for a moment. "Reminds us we're all part of something bigger." Sarah Beth pondered this as she prepared for another night under the open sky. Her body still ached from riding, but it was a different kind of pain now, one that spoke of progress, of moving forward. Elias had been nothing but respectful, keeping his distance while remaining attentive to her comfort and safety. As she drifted off to sleep, the stars wheeling overhead and the fire crackling softly, Sarah Beth realized something had shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but alongside it grew a tentative hope. Whatever waited at the end of this journey, at least she wasn't facing it alone. The night settled around them, peaceful and vast. On his side of the fire, Elias added another log to the flames, his movements quiet and careful not to disturb his sleeping wife. The title still felt strange to him, but watching her peaceful face in the firelight, he knew he'd made the right choice. Tomorrow would bring them closer to home, but for now, the stars kept their vigil over the small camp, where two strangers bound by circumstance and kindness rested under their ancient light. The morning sun was already high when they finally began climbing the last ridge. Sarah Beth's muscles had grown accustomed to the steady sway of the mule, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. 3 days of travel had left her yearning for solid walls and a real bed, no matter how humble. Elias led them up a narrow trail that switched back and forth across the mountainside. Pine needles cushioned their animals' hooves, releasing their sharp, clean scent with each step. As they neared the top, a cool breeze carried the sound of running water. "Almost there," Elias called back to her. "Just over this rise." When they crested the ridge, Sarah Beth caught her breath. Below them stretched a small valley, sheltered by rising peaks on 3 sides. A clear stream wound through it like a silver ribbon, And there, tucked against the tree line, stood Elias's homestead. The cabin was rough-hewn but solid, built from thick logs with a sturdy stone chimney. A small smokehouse stood off to one side, and a corral made from split rails enclosed a patch of grass near the stream. It was beautiful in its simplicity, yet the isolation struck her hard. The nearest neighbor must be miles away. "It ain't much," Elias said quietly, misreading her expression. "But it's home." Sarah Beth managed a small smile. "It looks very well built." They picked their way down the slope, Elias leading them along a path that showed signs of regular use. As they drew closer, Sarah Beth could see other details. A woodpile stacked neat against the cabin wall, herbs growing wild near the door, a bench made from a split log beneath the single window. Elias helped her down from the mule, his hands steady and respectful on her waist. Sarah Beth's legs trembled beneath her, stiff from riding. While Elias tended to the animals, she stood uncertainly by the cabin door, her small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. "Let me show you inside," Elias said, coming up beside her. He lifted the door latch, and Sarah Beth stepped into what would be her new home. The cabin was a single room, but larger than she'd expected. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the plank floor and whitewashed walls. An iron stove dominated one corner, its black surface well maintained. A handmade table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves lined one wall, holding an assortment of tools, dishes, and books. "The stove works well," Elias explained, moving around the space. "Keeps it warm even in the deepest winter. Water's just down at the stream, fresh and clear. Got a root cellar out back for storing up harvest." Sarah Beth's eyes were drawn to a shelf where a well-worn Bible lay, its leather cover softened with age. Beside it sat a small tin box and what looked like a woman's hair ribbon. She quickly looked away, knowing these must have belonged to Elias's first wife. The sleeping area was simply arranged. A sturdy bunk built into the wall, covered with a wool blanket. A trunk beneath it presumably held Elias's clothes. Sarah Beth noticed a hook on the wall where she could hang her dresses once she unpacked them. "I'll leave you to settle in," Elias said, moving toward the door. "Need to check the smokehouse and tend to the animals proper." Alone in the cabin, Sarah Beth slowly began to unpack her meager possessions. 3 dresses, carefully folded, 2 aprons, a handful of personal items wrapped in a handkerchief. Last, she withdrew her mother's quilt, shaking it out carefully before spreading it over the bunk. The familiar pattern brightened the plain space, and Sarah Beth felt tears prick at her eyes. Would she ever feel like she truly belonged here? The afternoon light was starting to soften when Sarah Beth finally squared her shoulders and began examining the cabin's supplies. In the pantry corner, she found dried beans, preserved venison, and basic staples. The sight of food stores sparked something practical in her. This, at least, was familiar territory. She had a pot of beans, soaking and venison thawing when Elias returned. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Thought I might make us some supper," Sarah Beth explained hesitantly. "If that's all right?" "More than all right," Elias replied, removing his hat. "Been a while since these walls smelled of cooking." Sarah Beth worked quietly, adding herbs she'd spotted growing outside the door to the simple stew. The familiar motions of cooking settled her nerves somewhat. This she knew how to do. Her mother had taught her well, despite their often lean circumstances. As the stew simmered, Elias brought in fresh water from the stream and lit the lamp, its gentle glow warming the growing dusk. The domestic sounds of ladle against pot and spoons being laid out filled the cabin. When the stew was ready, Sarah Beth served it in deep bowls she'd found on the shelves. They sat at the table, the lamp between them, and for a moment neither spoke. Sarah Beth waited anxiously as Elias took his first bite. "This is real fine cooking," he said after a moment, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Been living on my own basic fare too long, I reckon." The simple praise warmed something deep inside Sarah Beth. How long had it been since anyone had valued something she'd done? Her father's constant criticism had worn away at her sense of worth over the years. But here was a man, her husband now, strange as that seemed, actually thanking her for her efforts. "I'm glad you like it," she said softly. "My mother taught me to make do with what's on hand." "She taught you well," Elias replied, breaking off another piece of bread to sop up the broth. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. Outside, a whippoorwill called in the gathering dark, and the stream's constant murmur provided a gentle backdrop to their domestic scene. Sarah Beth found herself studying the cabin in the lamplight, trying to imagine herself as mistress here. The space was plain but clean, practical but not without comfort. Perhaps in time she could add small touches to make it feel more like home. Looking across the table at Elias, who was finishing the last of his stew with evident enjoyment, Sarah Beth felt a glimmer of hope. He had shown her nothing but kindness and respect since that horrible moment at the auction block. While she knew there would be challenges ahead, learning to live in such isolation, adapting to mountain ways, finding her place in this new life, at least she faced them with a decent man at her side. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and adjustments. But for now, Sarah Beth let herself simply exist in this moment. The warm glow of the lamp, the satisfaction of a meal well received, and the first fragile sense that perhaps she had found a place where her worth might finally be recognized. Dawn broke over the mountain valley, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. Sarah Beth woke to the sound of Elias already moving about outside, the regular thud of his axe splitting wood carrying through the cabin walls. She dressed quickly, determined to learn her new responsibilities, despite the lingering ache in her muscles from 3 days of riding. When she stepped outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Elias paused in his work, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Morning," he said. "Thought we might start with the basic chores, show you around proper." Sarah Beth nodded, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. "I'd like that." "Water first," Elias said, picking up 2 wooden buckets. "Stream's close, but the bank's a mite steep." They walked together to where the creek burbled past the cabin. The water ran clear and cold, but the path down was indeed tricky. Sarah Beth watched carefully as Elias demonstrated how to brace against a sturdy tree while filling the buckets. "Mind your footing," he cautioned, handing her an empty bucket. "No rush to it." Sarah Beth gripped the bucket's handle and made her way down. The slope wasn't long, but the dirt was loose under her feet. She managed to fill the bucket halfway before her arms began trembling from the awkward angle. "That's plenty for your first try," Elias said, no mockery in his voice. "Takes practice to fill them full without getting soaked." The walk back up seemed twice as long, water sloshing against the bucket's sides. Sarah Beth's arms ached, but she pressed on, determined not to show weakness. When she finally set the bucket down by the cabin door, her breath came in short gasps. "Rest a moment," Elias suggested, but Sarah Beth shook her head. "What's next?" she asked, straightening her shoulders. A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's face. "Reckon the cabin could use a sweep. Broom's just inside." The familiar task of sweeping helped settle Sarah Beth's nerves. She worked methodically, remembering her mother's instructions about starting from the far corner and working towards the door. The plank floor was well maintained, though dusty from their boots. Outside, she heard Elias speaking softly to the chickens as he scattered feed. The homey sounds of clucking and pecking drifted through the open door. When she finished sweeping, Sarah Beth stood in the doorway watching the small flock. They were healthy-looking birds, their feathers gleaming in the morning sun. "Want to try feeding them?" Elias asked, holding out the feed bucket. Sarah Beth approached cautiously. She'd never been around chickens before, having lived in town all her life. The nearest hen eyed her suspiciously. "Just scatter it gentle-like," Elias demonstrated. They'll come to know you soon enough." The grain made a soft pattering sound as it hit the dirt. Sarah Beth found herself smiling as the chickens hurried to peck at the offering, their movements quick and deliberate. One bold hen ventured close enough to peck near her feet. By mid-morning, Sarah Beth's whole body ached from the unaccustomed work. She'd helped Elias gather eggs, learned where the tools were stored, and begun to understand the daily rhythm of the homestead. Though she was tired, pride warmed her chest. She hadn't complained once, hadn't given up despite her burning muscles. "You've done good work," Elias said, heading out to check his trap lines. "Rest a spell if you need." Alone in the cabin, Sarah Beth decided to properly unpack her mother's quilt. The familiar patterns brought comfort as she shook it out, remembering long evenings watching her mother's needle flash in the lamplight. As she smoothed one corner, her fingers caught on a loose seam. Sarah Beth frowned, examining the stitching more closely. It wasn't like her mother to leave uneven work. As she turned the quilt, something crinkled inside. Careful fingers probed the opening, discovering several folded papers tucked between the layers. Her heart beating faster, Sarah Beth withdrew the papers. Her mother's distinctive handwriting covered the faded sheets, but before she could read them, a shadow fell across the doorway. Hastily, she tucked the papers back into the quilt's hiding place. A woman stood in the doorway, her dark eyes kind but searching. She wore a practical dress with beautiful beadwork at the collar, and her long black hair was braided with obvious care. Something about her bearing spoke of quiet authority. "I am Morning Star," she said, her voice warm and steady. "I saw smoke from your chimney and came to welcome new neighbors." Sarah Beth clutched the quilt unconsciously. "I'm Sarah Beth Turner. Elias, my husband. He's checking his trap lines." Morning Star's gaze fell to the quilt, and something flickered in her expression. "That pattern," she said softly, stepping closer. "I know it well. It speaks of promises made along this creek long ago." Sarah Beth looked down at the familiar design with new eyes. The blue and brown strips did seem to flow like water, while the geometric shapes could be mountains, or perhaps symbols she didn't understand. "My mother made it," she said uncertainly. "Before she passed." Morning Star nodded slowly. "Your mother kept wisdom in those stitches, secrets worth keeping, passed down through careful hands." She touched the edge of the quilt gently. "My grandmother's mother knew this pattern. It binds our people's promises together." Sarah Beth's mind whirled. Her mother had never spoken much about her Cherokee heritage, though Sarah Beth had sometimes caught her tracing the quilt's pattern with a faraway look in her eyes. The sound of boots on the path announced Elias's return. He paused in the doorway, then removed his hat respectfully. "Morning Star," he greeted. "You honor our home." "The honor is mine," Morning Star replied. "Your wife carries old stories in her mother's quilt, stories that matter to all who live along this water." Elias moved to stand near Sarah Beth, his presence steady and reassuring. He listened quietly as Morning Star spoke of shared waters and ancient agreements, his expression thoughtful. "The creek binds us all," Morning Star said finally, "just as these patterns bind our histories." She turned to Sarah Beth. "Your mother knew this. She kept what needed keeping." With a graceful nod to them both, Morning Star took her leave. Sarah Beth watched her walk away, following a path that seemed to disappear into the trees. The quilt in her hands suddenly felt heavier with meaning, its familiar patterns holding mysteries she'd never suspected. "You all right?" Elias asked quietly. Sarah Beth nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I never knew," she whispered. "About the quilt, about what Mother might have hidden in its pattern." Elias's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "Some secrets need time to show themselves," he said, "like spring water working its way up through rock." Sarah Beth clutched the quilt tighter, feeling the hidden papers crinkle between its layers. What other secrets had her mother sewn into this precious legacy? Morningstar's words echoed in her mind. Your mother kept secrets worth keeping. The afternoon light slanted through the cabin window, catching the quilt's faded colors and making them glow. Sarah Beth carefully folded it, her movements deliberate and reverent. Whatever mysteries it held would have to wait until she could examine the hidden papers properly. For now, she had chores to finish and a new life to build, one careful step at a time. The tin plates clinked softly as Sarah Beth washed them in the basin after supper. Through the cabin's small window, she watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. Elias had stepped out to check on the animals one last time before dark, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the mysterious papers hidden in her mother's quilt. The evening air grew cooler as Sarah Beth dried the last plate and set it carefully in the cupboard. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved toward the bed where the quilt lay folded. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the familiar pattern as she settled onto the edge of the mattress. For a moment, she simply traced the stitches with her fingertips, remembering how her mother's hands had guided the needle through these very seams. What secrets had she sewn into this legacy? Morningstar's words echoed in her mind. Your mother kept secrets worth keeping. Taking a deep breath, Sarah Beth found the loose seam again. The lamp flame flickered as she gently worked her fingers into the opening, drawing out the folded papers that had been hidden there for so long. The creases were deep, the paper worn soft at the edges from years pressed between layers of fabric. The cabin door creaked open, and Elias stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of pine and cooling earth. He paused when he saw her sitting there with the papers in her lap. Found something in that quilt of yours? He asked quietly, removing his hat and hanging it on its peg by the door. Sarah Beth nodded, her throat suddenly tight. Mother's handwriting, she managed to say, carefully unfolding the first sheet. Elias moved closer, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. The lamp cast his shadow long against the wall as he stood respectfully at her shoulder, waiting. The first page was covered in her mother's precise script. The ink faded, but still clear enough to read. Sarah Beth's eyes widened as she took in the formal language, the official stamps, the carefully recorded coordinates. It's a water claim, she whispered, her voice trembling. Filed with the Territory Office 15 years ago. Mother claimed water rights all along this creek valley. Elias drew in a sharp breath. He sat down slowly beside her on the bed, careful to keep space between them. May I? He asked, holding out his hand. Sarah Beth passed him the documents, watching as his eyes moved methodically across each page. His expression grew more serious with each line he read. This is a proper filing, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Your mother knew what she was doing. She registered these rights before most folks even knew this valley existed. He looked up at Sarah Beth, his eyes grave. Do you understand what this means? She shook her head, feeling suddenly small and uncertain. I never knew Mother had any claims or property. Father always said we had nothing worth having. Elias's jaw tightened at the mention of her father. Your mother was wiser than he knew. These water rights, they're worth more than gold to the right people. Ranchers need water for cattle. Miners need it for their operations, having legal claim to a water source like this creek. He shook his head slowly. It's power, Sarah Beth. Real power. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. All her life, she'd been told she was worthless. Too big, too plain, too much of a burden. Yet here in her hands was proof that her mother had seen further, planned deeper, left her daughter a legacy that men would fight to possess. I don't know what to do with this, she admitted, her voice small in the quiet cabin. I never thought I'd have anything worth having, let alone something others might want to take. Elias carefully refolded the papers, his movements deliberate. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, but I reckon your mother didn't hide these papers just to have them found and sold off quick." He handed the documents back to her. She must have had a reason for keeping them secret, for waiting until the right time. Sarah Beth's fingers closed around the papers. Morningstar seemed to know something about it, the way she talked about the quilt pattern, about promises along the creek. Could be your mother understood more than most about the importance of this water. Elias's voice was thoughtful. These valleys, they hold old agreements, treaties and promises that go back generations. A memory surfaced. Her mother sitting by lamplight, needle moving steadily through the quilt layers, singing softly in a language Sarah Beth didn't understand. There had always been so much about her mother's heritage, her Cherokee blood, that remained unspoken. I feel, Sarah Beth struggled to find the words. I feel overwhelmed, like I'm standing at the edge of something so much bigger than myself. Elias nodded slowly. That's a natural way to feel, but you're not standing alone anymore. His quiet assurance brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Sarah Beth blinked them back, carefully returning the papers to their hiding place in the quilt seam. You reckon, she hesitated, then continued softly. You reckon God had a hand in all this? In you being there today? In these papers being found now? I surely do. Elias's voice was firm. The Lord's timing ain't always clear to us right away, but I believe He guides our steps. He paused, then added gently, Would you like to pray about it? Sarah Beth nodded, grateful for the suggestion. It had been years since she'd prayed with another person, her father having long since abandoned any pretense of faith. Elias moved to kneel beside the bed, and Sarah Beth followed his example. The rough wooden floor was solid beneath her knees, the familiar quilt pattern visible in the lamplight when she folded her hands upon it. Lord, Elias began, his deep voice soft but steady, we come before you tonight with grateful hearts. You've brought paths together that we couldn't have seen coming, and revealed blessings hidden away for your proper time. Sarah Beth felt tears threatening again as he continued, We ask for your wisdom and guidance. Show us how to be good stewards of what you've entrusted to us. Help us see your purpose in all things, even those that seem too big for us to carry alone. Amen, Sarah Beth whispered when he finished. The word felt right in her mouth, like coming home to a truth she'd always known. They rose from their knees, and Elias moved to bank the fire for the night. Sarah Beth carefully smoothed the quilt, making sure the hidden papers were secure in their resting place. As she prepared for bed, her mind drifted to her father's face, the angry flush that would color his cheeks whenever someone mentioned her mother's people, the bitter twist of his mouth when he spoke of debts and burdens. In the quiet darkness, his warning seemed to whisper through her memories. Debts never die, girl. They just grow teeth and come back hungry. Sarah Beth shivered, pulling the quilt closer around her shoulders as she lay down. But the familiar weight of it brought comfort now, carrying as it did the evidence of her mother's foresight and love. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she faced them now with unexpected resources. Water rights, yes, but more importantly, a husband who saw her worth and a growing sense that God's hand had guided her path to this very place. Outside, a night bird called softly, and the creek murmured its endless song. Sarah Beth closed her eyes, letting the peaceful sounds of her new home wash over her. Her last conscious thought was of her mother's hands, steady and sure, sewing strength and secrets into every careful stitch of the quilt that now covered her daughter's dreams. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear, dew sparkling on the grass outside the cabin window. Sarah Beth stood at the iron stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot of bubbling oatmeal. A week had passed since she'd discovered the water rights hidden in her mother's quilt, and each day brought new rhythms to learn, new skills to master. The cabin door creaked open as Elias returned from the barn, bringing with him the fresh scent of hay and morning air. "Molly gave extra milk today," he said, setting down a brimming pail. "Reckon she's taking to you better than she ever took to me." Sarah Beth smiled, remembering her first awkward attempts at milking the stubborn goat. Her fingers had been clumsy, but Elias had shown endless patience, demonstrating the proper technique without a hint of mockery. "She just needed a gentle touch is all," she said, reaching for 2 tin cups to pour their morning coffee. Elias settled at the table, his eyes crinkling with warmth as he watched her move about the kitchen. The past week had brought changes to them both. Sarah Beth's movements were more sure now, less hesitant. The constant fear that had shadowed her eyes was fading, replaced by quiet confidence as she learned each new task. "That cornbread you made yesterday was mighty fine," he said, accepting the cup she offered. "Reminded me of my mama's cooking." Sarah Beth felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "It's not quite right yet. Need to get used to this altitude. Everything bakes different up here in the mountains." "Well, I ain't complaining about being your test subject." Elias's smile was gentle. "Nice having good food on the table again. Nice having—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Having laughter in the cabin." It was true. Sarah Beth had surprised herself by laughing more in the past week than she could remember doing in years. There was joy in learning new things, in feeling useful, in being treated with respect. Even their mistakes became occasions for shared amusement rather than shame. After breakfast, they headed out to the wood lot together. The autumn chill meant they needed to build up their firewood stores before winter set in. Elias showed Sarah Beth how to identify the best trees for cutting. Not too green, not too dried out. "My pa taught me to fell trees when I was just knee-high to a grasshopper," Elias said, demonstrating the proper angle for the axe. "Used to tell me the forest provides, but only if you treat it with respect." Sarah Beth leaned against a sturdy pine, catching her breath between loads. "My mother used to say something similar about her garden. She'd talk to the plants like they were old friends." She smiled at the memory. Father thought she was touched in the head, but everything she grew flourished. Elias paused in his chopping, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sounds like she was a wise woman, your mother." "She was." Sarah Beth's voice softened. "She taught me so many things I didn't understand at the time, like that quilt, all those patterns she insisted I learn to sew, saying they told stories I'd need to know someday." They worked steadily through the morning, the rhythm of the axe blending with birdsong and the distant murmur of the creek. Sarah Beth found she enjoyed the physical labor, even when her muscles protested. Each stack of wood they added to the pile felt like an investment in their shared future. The sun had passed its peak when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Elias straightened, hand moving instinctively to his belt, but relaxed when Morningstar appeared around the bend in the trail. She sat tall on her paint pony, her dark eyes taking in the scene before her. "The trees give good wood today," she said by way of greeting, dismounting with fluid grace. "But you should listen to what else they say." Sarah Beth set down her armload of wood, brushing dirt from her skirts. There was something in Morningstar's expression that made her stomach tighten with concern. "What news do you bring?" Elias asked directly, resting his axe against a stump. Morningstar moved closer, her moccasins silent on the pine needles. "Bad winds blow from the south. Men in fine clothes ride the trails, studying the watercourses, making marks in books." She looked pointedly at Sarah Beth. "They ask questions about old claims, about rights filed long ago." Sarah Beth felt her heart skip. "They know about the water rights?" "They suspect." Morningstar's voice was grave. "Water is life in these mountains. The ranch syndicates grow hungry, pushing their herds further north each season. They need streams like this one." She gestured to the creek that ran through Elias's land. "Men kill for such treasure." Elias moved to stand beside Sarah Beth, his solid presence steadying her. "We've got legal claim to this water. Your mother made sure of that," he said quietly. "Papers mean little to men with gold in their eyes," Morningstar replied. "My people know this truth too well. Treaties become shadows when greed walks in daylight." Sarah Beth twisted her hands in her apron, the joy of the morning turning to ash in her mouth. "What can we do?" Morningstar's expression softened as she looked at the younger woman. "Be watchful, be strong. Remember that you do not stand alone." She reached into her beaded bag and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Herbs for protection? Burn them at your doorway each night." Sarah Beth accepted the pouch with trembling fingers, breathing in the sharp, clean scent of sage and sweetgrass. "Thank you." "My people have watched over this valley for generations," Morningstar continued. "We know its voice, its spirits. The water that flows here carries old promises." She touched the sleeve of Sarah Beth's dress. "Your mother understood this. That is why she claimed it as she did." Elias stepped forward. "Will you stay and share our meal?" "We've got fresh bread and stew." But Morningstar shook her head. "I must return to my family. Others need to know what comes." She swung easily back onto her pony, gathering the reins. "Watch the signs. Listen to the creek's song. It will warn when danger walks near." They watched her ride away, the paint pony blending into the dappled forest shadows. Sarah Beth felt the weight of the herb pouch in her hand, real and tangible against the ghostly fears Morningstar's warning had raised. "Elias?" Her voice sounded small even to her own ears. "What are we going to do?" He turned to her, his face serious but calm. "We're going to finish cutting this wood. We're going to keep building our life here, and I promise you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. "I will protect you and what's rightfully yours." Sarah Beth looked up at him, seeing the strength and certainty in his eyes. "I never thought having something worth keeping would be so frightening." "That's often the way of it," he said softly. "But fear don't make the keeping any less worthwhile." They stood together in the clearing, their joined hands a small defiance against the threats gathering on the horizon. The creek sang its endless song, birds called from the treetops, and the autumn wind whispered through the pines. All around them, life continued its steady rhythms, even as unease settled like an early frost over their newfound peace. Sarah Beth squeezed Elias's hand once before letting go. "We should finish the wood before sundown." He nodded, appreciation flickering in his eyes at her resolve. They returned to their work, the axe biting deeper, the woodpile growing higher. But now they kept their ears tuned to the sounds of the forest, alert for hoofbeats that might herald the arrival of men with gold in their eyes and greed in their hearts. The sun continued its westward arc, painting the mountains in amber light. Sarah Beth paused now and then to touch the herb pouch in her pocket, drawing comfort from its presence. She thought of her mother, of hidden papers and quilted secrets, of wisdom passed down through generations of women who understood the true value of things that flowed free and wild through the land. The life she and Elias were building felt more precious now, more fragile, yet somehow stronger for knowing its worth. Each piece of wood they stacked, each shared smile, each small domestic task was an act of faith. Faith in each other, in the rightness of their cause, in the possibility of happiness despite the shadows gathering at the edges of their world. The autumn day had faded into a purple dusk when Sarah Beth heard horses approaching the cabin. Elias had left before dawn to check his trapline, promising to return by nightfall. She set down her mending and peered through the window, her heart quickening at the sight of two unfamiliar riders. The men dismounted with casual arrogance, their spurs jingling against the packed earth. Both wore city clothes gone trail dusty, with guns riding low on their hips. The taller one adjusted his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and meanness. "Evening, miss," he called out, his politeness as false as a snake's smile. "Might we have a word?" Sarah Beth's fingers found the herb pouch Morning Star had given her, drawing strength from its presence. "State your business," she answered, keeping the cabin door between them. The shorter man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We represent certain parties holding debts against one Walter Hawkins." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "That being your father, ain't it?" Ice formed in Sarah Beth's stomach. "I'm Mrs. Turner now. My father's debts are his own." The tall man's laugh held no humor. "That's not how the law sees it, miss. Your daddy sold you to cover them debts. $1 silver don't square no accounts." "I am Elias Turner's lawful wife," Sarah Beth said firmly, though her voice wanted to tremble. "We were married proper in the church with witnesses and signed papers." "Don't make no difference." The shorter man stepped closer, his boot heel grinding against the wooden porch. "Property's property. That mountain man of yours had no right to buy what was already sold." Sarah Beth lifted her chin. "I am not property. I never was." "Listen here, girl," the tall man growled, patience wearing thin. "You can come quiet like now, or we can return with the sheriff and make it official. Either way, you're coming with us to square your daddy's accounts." "I will do no such thing." Sarah Beth gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "My husband will be home soon. I suggest you leave." The shorter man hawked and spat again. "Ain't asking, girl. We got papers saying you belong to our employers." "Your papers mean nothing," Sarah Beth declared, though fear fluttered in her chest. "I have my marriage certificate and my own legal documents. Now get off our land." The tall man's hand drifted to his gun. "Maybe we ought to wait for your mountain man. Have us a proper discussion about ownership." "Maybe you ought to ride out while you still can," Sarah Beth countered, silently praying for Elias's return. The men exchanged dark looks. "We'll be back," the tall one promised, "with the sheriff and enough men to make sure things go smooth. Best pack your things." They mounted up, wheels of dust rising beneath their horses' hooves as they rode away. Sarah Beth watched until they disappeared into the gathering darkness, then sagged against the doorframe, her legs weak with delayed terror. She stayed by the window, jumping at every sound, until she heard the familiar cadence of Elias's horse. He appeared out of the twilight like a prayer answered, leading his mount with several rabbit carcasses tied to his saddle. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "Sarah Beth?" He quickly closed the distance between them, his eyes scanning the yard for threats. She fell into his arms, words tumbling out as she recounted the visit. Elias held her close, his body tense as wire as he listened. They said I still belong to Father's creditors," she finished, her voice muffled against his chest. "That our marriage means nothing." "Like hell it doesn't," Elias growled. He drew back enough to look into her face. "You stood strong against them. I'm proud of you." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I wouldn't let them see it." "You've got more courage than any 10 men, he said softly. Then his expression hardened. "But they'll be back, sure as sunrise, and they'll bring trouble with them." Sarah Beth stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself. "What do we do?" Elias paced the cabin's length, thinking hard. "Those water rights your mama left you, they're worth more than any debts your father ran up. I reckon that's what this is really about." "The papers in my quilt?" "Aye." He stopped pacing. "Someone must have found out about them. Maybe your father knew all along, been waiting to use them to clear his debts." Sarah Beth sank into a chair. "Morning Star warned us men would kill for water rights. Which is why we need to protect them." Elias knelt beside her. "First thing tomorrow, we'll ride into town. Get those papers filed proper with the county clerk where no one can steal or destroy them." "But the debt collectors?" "Let them come," Elias said grimly. "Once those papers are filed, they can't touch them. And you're my wife, legal and true. no matter what they claim. Sarah Beth covered his rough hand with hers. I never thought I'd bring such trouble to your door. You brought life and light to my door, he corrected her. The trouble ain't your doing. It's men's greed, pure and simple. He squeezed her fingers. We'll face it together. They spent the evening preparing for the next day's journey. Sarah Beth carefully removed the water rights documents from their hiding place in the quilt, wrapping them in oilcloth. Elias cleaned his rifle and checked their ammunition. Neither spoke much, but their shared purpose filled the cabin with quiet determination. After a simple supper, they sat together by the fire. Sarah Beth leaned against Elias's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. I wanted to believe we could just live peacefully up here, she murmured, that the past would stay past. Peace comes dear in these mountains, Elias replied, but that don't mean it ain't worth fighting for. Sarah Beth thought of Morning Star's warnings, of the debt collector's threats, of all the forces gathering against them. Yet somehow, sitting here with Elias's arm around her, she felt stronger than her fears. We should try to sleep, Elias said finally. Tomorrow will come early. They banked the fire and prepared for bed, moving through their evening routine with practiced ease. But both knew sleep would be long in coming, their minds full of tomorrow's journey and what might await them in town. In the darkness, Sarah Beth whispered, "Thank you for standing with me." Elias's voice came back sure and steady. "Always will." The night settled around their cabin like a blanket, stars wheeling overhead, while below, a mountain couple lay awake, planning how to protect what was theirs by right and law. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft rose and gold as Elias and Sarah Beth prepared for their journey. The morning air held autumn's first bite, promising winter wasn't far behind. Sarah Beth wrapped her shawl tighter as she watched Elias hitch their mule, Bessie, to the small wagon. You sure about this? Elias asked, checking the harness one final time. His eyes held concern as he looked at his wife. Sarah Beth patted the oilcloth-wrapped documents tucked securely in her skirt pocket. These papers need protecting. We can't hide up here forever. Elias nodded, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. The wooden boards creaked as she settled herself, smoothing her best dress, the one she'd worn for their wedding just weeks ago. It already felt like a lifetime had passed since that day. They set out as the sun cleared the mountain ridge. Elias handled the reins while leading his horse, Thunder, behind the wagon. The trail wound down through stands of aspen, their leaves beginning to turn golden. Sarah Beth watched the familiar landmarks of their mountain home fade into the distance. The lightning-struck pine that marked their property line, the creek bend where she'd learned to wash clothes, the meadow where Morning Star had shown her which plants made healing tea. The journey down was slow going. The wagon wheels jolted over every rock and root, making Sarah Beth grateful for the cushion she'd thought to bring. Around mid-morning, they passed the first homestead, the Anderson place. Mrs. Anderson was hanging wash, and her face pinched with curiosity at the sight of them. Word will spread fast now, Elias commented, keeping his voice low. Sarah Beth squared her shoulders. Let it spread. We've nothing to hide. More settlers appeared as they descended. Men working fields, women tending gardens, children driving cattle. Each time, the work would pause, heads turning to watch the mountain man and his new wife pass. Sarah Beth could almost hear the whispers flying between farms. That's her, the fat girl Turner bought for $1. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was Mrs. Sarah Beth Turner, with legal water rights that could change the fate of the entire valley. The thought gave her strength to hold her head high. They stopped at noon to rest the animals and eat a simple meal of bread and dried apple slices. Sarah Beth's legs were stiff from sitting, and she paced a bit to work out the aches. How much further? She asked, shading her eyes to look down the trail. "Another 3 hours, maybe 4, Elias answered, checking Bessie's hooves for stones. "Depends how the trail holds up." The afternoon grew hot as they continued their descent. Dust coated everything. Their clothes, their faces, even their teeth felt gritty. They passed more homesteads, then larger ranches. The curious stares turned harder, more calculating, especially from the ranch hands who rode past. "Them's Kingston ranchmen," Elias muttered after one such group passed. "They've been trying to control the water rights in this valley for years." Sarah Beth's hand strayed to her pocket, touching the precious documents. No wonder Father never spoke of Mother's claim. He must have known how valuable it was. The sun was well past its peak when they finally reached the outskirts of town. The settlement had grown since Sarah Beth had last seen it. New buildings lined the main street, and the constant ring of hammers spoke of more going up. They found the livery stable, where Elias arranged care for their animals. "Best clean up a bit before seeing the clerk," he suggested, brushing dust from his coat. Sarah Beth agreed, using their water canteen to wash her face and hands, then smoothing her travel-mussed hair. The documents felt heavy in her pocket as they walked down the boardwalk toward the county clerk's office. The clerk's office occupied a narrow building between the general store and the telegraph office. A bell jangled as they entered, and Mr. Peterson, the clerk, peered at them over his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Well now," he said, setting aside his pen. "If it ain't the Turners. Heard tell you 2 got hitched." "That's right," Elias confirmed. "And we've got some papers need filing." Sarah Beth stepped forward, carefully withdrawing the oilcloth package. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, laying the documents on Mr. Peterson's desk. The clerk adjusted his spectacles and began reading. His eyebrows rose higher with each page. "These are water rights," he said finally, "filed 15 years ago by one Rebecca Hawkins." "My mother," Sarah Beth explained softly. Mr. Peterson shuffled through the papers again, checking dates and signatures. "Everything appears to be in order, properly witnessed and notarized." He looked up at them sharply. "You do realize what these are worth?" Elias's hand found Sarah Beth's shoulder. "We do." "Powerful men won't like this," Peterson warned, his voice dropping. "These rights control nearly half the water flow through the valley. The big ranches have been fighting over them for years." "The rights are legal," Sarah Beth insisted. "They belonged to my mother and now they're mine." Peterson nodded slowly. "That they are, and I'll record them proper." He reached for his big leather-bound registry. "But you mind what I'm saying? Some folks won't care about legal when there's water at stake." The scratch of his pen filled the office as he carefully copied the information. Sarah Beth watched each letter form, her heart pounding. Finally, Peterson sprinkled sand over the ink to dry it, then stamped the original documents with the county seal. "There," he announced. "These copies stay in the registry. The originals are yours to keep, though I'd suggest finding a safe place for them." "Much obliged," Elias said, helping Sarah Beth rewrap the papers. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening. Sarah Beth felt exhausted but relieved. "It's done," she whispered. "Aye," Elias agreed. "Now let's find some supper and a bed for the night. We can head home first thing tomorrow." They found rooms at the Silver Dollar Inn, where the innkeeper's wife served them a hot meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Sarah Beth was too tired to care about the sideways glances from other diners. She focused on her food, grateful for its warmth and substance after the long day's journey. In their room, Sarah Beth sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what they'd done. "I keep thinking about what Mr. Peterson said, about powerful men not liking this." Elias pulled off his boots, setting them carefully by the door. "He's right. But we did what needed doing. Those rights are protected now, recorded proper in the law books." Sarah Beth nodded, then reached for her mother's Bible in her traveling bag. "I need to pray," she said simply. Elias touched her shoulder gently. "I'll give you some privacy. Need to check on the animals anyway." When he'd gone, Sarah Beth knelt beside the bed, her mother's Bible open before her. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength for whatever's coming. Help me be worthy of this inheritance, this responsibility." She touched the Bible's worn pages, remembering her mother's hands doing the same. "Help me use it wisely, for the good of all." The street noise drifted up through the window, boots on boardwalks, wagon wheels, voices calling evening greetings. Sarah Beth rose from her knees, feeling steadier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, she and Elias, with faith and determination. She was hanging her dress when Elias returned. "Animals are settled," he reported. "Town's buzzing with talk, though. Word spreading fast about the water rights." Sarah Beth sighed. "I suppose we couldn't keep it secret forever." "No," Elias agreed, "but at least now the law's on our side." He began banking the room's small stove for the night. "Try to rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Sarah Beth slipped beneath the quilts, their unfamiliar weight and smell reminding her how far she was from their mountain cabin. But Elias was here, his steady presence a comfort in the growing darkness. They had done what they came to do. The water rights were filed and recorded, safe from those who would steal or destroy them. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by the muffled sounds of the town settling for the night. Sarah Beth's last conscious thought was a prayer for strength, knowing that filing the papers was only the beginning. Morning brought no peace to Sarah Beth and Elias. They had just finished a simple breakfast of eggs and coffee at the inn when heavy boots thundered up the stairs. Sheriff Doyle burst through the door, two deputies flanking him with hands on their revolvers. "Sarah Beth Turner," the sheriff announced, pulling a folded paper from his vest. "You're served with this writ, charging you with fraud and unpaid debts against Kingston Ranch Holdings." Sarah Beth's hands trembled as she took the document. Elias rose from his chair, moving protectively closer to her side. "What's the meaning of this, Sheriff? Those water rights are legal and proper filed." "According to this complaint," Doyle drawled. "Miss Hawkins here." "Mrs. Turner," Elias corrected sharply. The sheriff's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Turner, then. She's named in outstanding debts from her father, debts that supersede any claim to property or water rights. Kingston Ranch maintains she has no authority to file those documents." Sarah Beth scanned the writ, her heart pounding. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear enough. They meant to strip her of everything, using her father's debts as leverage. "That's nonsense," Elias growled. "Her mother filed those rights 15 years ago, before any debts. The clerk confirmed it yesterday. That'll be for the judge to decide." The sheriff hooked his thumbs in his gun belt. "Meanwhile, them papers are staying sealed at the courthouse." Sarah Beth touched Elias's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We'll fight this properly," she said softly. "Through the law." "Smart woman," Doyle smirked. "Best listen to your wife, Turner, unless you're fixing to make trouble." Elias's jaw clenched. "No trouble, just justice." "Then you won't mind coming down to give a proper statement." The sheriff gestured towards the door. "Ladies first, Mrs. Turner." They walked down the inn's narrow stairs, Sarah Beth clutching the writ in one hand and her mother's Bible in the other. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street as townsfolk stopped to stare. At the jailhouse, Deputy Mason directed Sarah Beth to a hard wooden chair while the sheriff led Elias to his office. Through the open door, she could hear their voices rising. "This is pure harassment," Elias insisted. "Using a father's debts to steal a daughter's rightful inheritance?" "Law's the law," Doyle replied. "And right now the law says—" A crash interrupted him. Sarah Beth jumped to her feet as sounds of struggle erupted from the office. Deputy Mason blocked her path, his hand on his gun. "Stay back, ma'am." More crashes, then the thud of fists on flesh. Sarah Beth pressed her hands to her mouth as Elias was dragged out, blood trickling from his lip. His hands were cuffed behind him. "Resisting an officer," the sheriff announced, straightening his vest. "That's earned you a cell, Turner. Cool your heels while your wife sorts out this mess." "Elias!" Sarah Beth reached for him, but Deputy Mason held her back. "I'm all right," Elias assured her, though his eye was already swelling. "Don't let them bully you, Sarah Beth. You're stronger than they know." The deputies marched him toward the cells in back. Sarah Beth turned on the sheriff, anger replacing her fear. "This is wrong, and you know it." "What I know," Doyle said, "is that Kingston Ranch pays good money to keep order in this town. Your mama's old claim is stirring up trouble we don't need." "You mean trouble for the men trying to steal our water rights?" Sarah Beth retorted. "I won't be frightened away from what's rightfully mine." The sheriff's face hardened. "Judge Williams arrives tomorrow. 10 o'clock sharp, we'll sort this out proper. Meanwhile, your husband stays put until he learns some manners." He opened the door. "Good day, Mrs. Turner." Sarah Beth lifted her chin and walked out, ignoring the stares from the growing crowd. Her legs felt wooden as she climbed the stairs back to their room at the inn. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow herself to shake. She sank onto the bed, clutching her mother's Bible. The writ lay crumpled beside her, its legal threat seeming to mock her solitude. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't help Elias or protect their rights. The afternoon crawled by. Sarah Beth read and reread the writ, trying to understand every word. She studied her mother's Bible too, finding comfort in familiar passages marked by Rebecca's careful hand. One verse caught her eye. "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." As sunset painted the window orange, someone knocked. Sarah Beth opened it cautiously to find Morning Star's daughter, Little Bird, with a covered basket. "Mama sent food," the girl said. "She says you need strength for tomorrow." Sarah Beth's throat tightened at the kindness. "Thank you. Please tell her I'm grateful." Little Bird hesitated. "Mama also says remember, water belongs to the people, not the men with paper money." Sarah Beth nodded, touching the girl's hand. "Your mama's wise. I won't forget." After Little Bird left, Sarah Beth managed to eat some of the hearty stew and fry bread. Her appetite was poor, but she forced herself, knowing she needed clear thoughts for tomorrow. As darkness fell, she wrapped herself in her mother's quilt and tried to rest. Sleep proved elusive. Finally, she lit the lamp and opened the Bible again, reading until the words blurred. Dawn found her already dressed and pacing. As soon as she heard movement in the jail, she hurried over. Deputy Mason was on duty. "Please," she said, "I need to see my husband." The deputy hesitated, then shrugged. 5 minutes. He led her to the cells in back. Elias sat on a narrow cot, his face bruised but his eyes clear. He stood when he saw her, coming to the bars. "Sarah Beth." He reached through to touch her cheek. "You should be resting." "How can I rest with you in here?" She covered his hand with hers. "Are you badly hurt?" "Just bruised pride, mostly." He tried to smile. "The sheriff fights dirty." "The hearing's at 10 o'clock. I'll speak for us both, tell them about Mother's claim and how legal it is. You'll do fine." His voice was gentle. "You're stronger than you believe, Sarah Beth. I saw it that first day at the auction block. Dignity they couldn't touch." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm scared, Elias." "I know. But remember what brought us here. Truth and justice. God sees that, even if the sheriff won't." "Time's up," Deputy Mason called. Sarah Beth quickly pressed her lips to Elias's fingers. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," he whispered. "Now go show them what mountain women are made of." She walked back through the quiet streets, the sun just touching the courthouse roof. Her mother's Bible was tucked in her pocket, its familiar weight giving her courage. Elias believed in her. Morning Star's people believed in her. Most importantly, she was beginning to believe in herself. In their room, she smoothed her best dress and pinned up her hair neatly. The mirror showed a woman she hardly recognized, determined, dignified, ready to stand for what was right. Sarah Beth straightened her shoulders. "Guide my words, Lord," she prayed softly. "Let justice roll down like waters." She gathered the writ and other papers, checked the clock, and took a deep breath. It was time to face whatever came next. Not as the mocked daughter or the pitied bride, but as Sarah Beth Turner, rightful heir to her mother's legacy and defender of their mountain home. The town hall's wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious onlookers. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden shafts. Sarah Beth sat straight-backed in the front row, her mother's Bible in her lap, watching as Judge Williams settled behind the makeshift bench. He was older than she'd expected, with steel-gray hair and reading spectacles that caught the light. His black robes seemed out of place in the frontier town hall, but they lent gravity to the proceedings. The judge's stern gaze swept the room, silencing the whispers. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced, his voice echoing. "The matter of Kingston Ranch Syndicate versus Turner regarding contested water rights." 3 well-dressed lawyers for Kingston Ranch rose from their table, smooth as cats. Their leader, Mr. Blackwood, adjusted his silk vest with manicured hands that had never known real work. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, "this is a simple matter of unpaid debts. John Hawkins, the defendant's father, borrowed heavily from our client. Those debts remain outstanding, making any supposed inheritance void." Sarah Beth felt her hands trembling. She gripped her mother's Bible tighter, drawing strength from its worn leather cover. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, "the defendant herself was legally auctioned to settle these debts. Her subsequent marriage to Elias Turner cannot override prior financial obligations." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah Beth kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned at the mention of the auction. Judge Williams raised his gavel for quiet. "Mrs. Turner," the judge called, "please take the stand." Sarah Beth rose on shaking legs. The wooden witness chair felt hard and exposed as every eye in the room fixed upon her. Judge Williams nodded encouragingly. "Tell us your understanding of these water rights, Mrs. Turner." Sarah Beth took a deep breath, remembering Elias's words about her strength. "Your Honor, my mother, Rebecca Hawkins, filed these claims legally, years before any ranch syndicate came to our valley. She kept the papers safe, sewn inside a family quilt, knowing my father would have sold them for drink." "Objection," Blackwood interrupted. "Hearsay about the father's character." "Sustained," the judge said. "Please continue, Mrs. Turner, but stick to the facts about the water rights." Sarah Beth nodded, clasping her hands to still their trembling. "The papers were properly filed and witnessed. My mother gave me the quilt before she died, though I didn't know its secret until last week. She wanted the water rights preserved for all who live in the valley, not just the powerful." Snickers rose from the crowd. Blackwood's smile was sharp as a knife. "And we're to believe these conveniently discovered papers, hidden in a quilt, after your father's debts made you worthless enough to be sold at auction?" "Objection?" Sarah Beth's voice rang out stronger than she'd expected. "My worth isn't measured by my father's debts or that shameful auction. My husband saw my dignity when others mocked. These water rights are my mother's legacy, legally filed and witnessed." The judge leaned forward. "Do you have any witnesses who can verify your mother's ownership of these rights?" Before Sarah Beth could answer, the hall's double doors swung open. Morning Star entered, her bearing regal in her traditional dress, beadwork catching the sun. The crowd fell silent, parting as she walked forward. "I can speak to this truth," Morning Star announced, her voice clear and strong. The judge gestured for her to approach. "Your name for the record?" I am Morning Star of the Lakota people. Rebecca Hawkins was my friend. We shared the valley's water in peace before the ranch syndicates came. Blackwood stood. Your Honor, surely you won't accept testimony from a woman who has lived by these waters for generations? Judge Williams cut him off. I'll hear her speak. Morning Star moved to stand beside Sarah Beth. Rebecca Hawkins understood water belongs to all people. She filed her claim to protect the valley from men who would fence off what Creator gave freely. The quilt pattern itself tells this story. The flowing river, the four directions, the circle of life. She trusted her daughter to carry this truth. Sarah Beth felt tears prick her eyes at this defense of her mother's wisdom. The crowd's mockery had faded to thoughtful silence. When Rebecca knew she was dying, Morning Star continued, she called me to witness as she sewed those papers into the quilt. Tell Sarah Beth when the time comes, she said. The water must flow for all. I have kept that promise. Blackwood surged to his feet. This is absurd! Are we to let valuable water rights be controlled by a woman sold for $1 and her savage friend? The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Mr. Blackwood, you will show respect in this court or face contempt charges. He turned to Sarah Beth. Do you have the original papers? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah Beth handed over the documents from her mother's quilt. The county clerk confirmed their authenticity yesterday. Judge Williams studied the papers carefully through his spectacles. The hall remained hushed, waiting. Sarah Beth felt Morning Star's steady presence beside her like a foundation stone. These water rights were properly filed and witnessed, the judge finally declared. No subsequent debts can invalidate them. As for the matter of the auction, he fixed Blackwood with a stern glare. This court finds that Mrs. Turner's legal marriage supersedes any such irregular proceedings. Relief flooded through Sarah Beth. She swayed slightly, steadied by Morning Star's gentle hand on her shoulder. Furthermore, the judge continued, I order Mr. Turner's immediate release from custody. Sheriff Doyle will answer to this court tomorrow regarding that irregular detention. He struck his gavel. These water rights are confirmed as the legal property of Sarah Beth Turner. Court is adjourned. The hall erupted in mixed reaction, cheers, grumbles, and excited chatter. Blackwood and his fellow lawyers gathered their papers with dark looks. But Sarah Beth barely noticed. She was already hurrying toward the door, Morning Star beside her, eager to share the news with Elias. The morning sun felt warmer now as they crossed the street to the jail. Deputy Mason was already unlocking Elias's cell, having heard the judge's order. When Elias emerged, his face still bruised but his eyes bright, Sarah Beth flew into his arms. You did it, he murmured into her hair. I knew you would. We did it, Sarah Beth corrected, including Morning Star in her glance. All of us together, standing for what's right. Morning Star smiled. Your mother would be proud, child. The water will flow freely, as she wished. They walked out into the street together, the mountain man, his brave wife, and their Lakota friend. Sarah Beth felt a new strength in her heart, knowing she had honored both her mother's wisdom and her own dignity. The water rights were secure, and with them, the promise of justice in their mountain valley. The lawyers exchanged knowing smiles before Blackwood rose again, straightening his vest with theatrical flair. Your Honor, let us speak plainly, he drawled. Are we to believe this? His lip curled. Substantial woman is fit to manage such valuable water rights? Someone who couldn't even maintain her own proper size and deportment? Cruel laughter rippled through parts of the gallery. Sarah Beth's face burned, but she held her head high. Why, her own father couldn't feed her, another lawyer added. How could she possibly? I need to speak! A rough voice cut through the mockery. A weathered miner stood up in the back, his hat crushed in his hands. About John Hawkins and them debts. Judge Williams gestured him forward. State your name for the record. Thomas Riley, Your Honor. I worked claims with John Hawkins. The miner twisted his hat nervously. Them debts to Kingston Ranch, they ain't real. John forged papers to cover what he stole from the mine payroll. I helped him do it. God forgive me." A shocked murmur swept the room. The judge leaned forward, suddenly intent. "Are you willing to testify to this under oath, Mr. Riley?" "Yes, sir. Got the proof right here." He pulled crumpled papers from his coat. "Been eating at my conscience." Blackwood's face had gone pale. The judge examined the documents, his expression grave. "In light of this new evidence, I'll delay final ruling until Mr. Turner can testify. Bailiff, see Mr. Riley is properly deposed." Sarah Beth's legs felt weak with relief as she left the hall. Truth was finally coming to light. Dawn broke over the town as the bailiff unlocked Elias's cell. His face was still bruised, but his eyes were clear and determined as he walked into the crowded courtroom. Sarah Beth's heart leaped at the sight of him. "Mr. Turner," Judge Williams said, "please tell the court about the events of July 15th. Elias's voice rang steady and true. "I paid $1 silver at public auction for Sarah Beth Hawkins. Couldn't stand to see her treated so cruel. Took her straight to Reverend Parker's church and married her proper, with witnesses present." "The marriage registry confirms this," the judge noted, studying his papers. "And the water rights discovered in her mother's quilt." "Sarah Beth came to our marriage with that inheritance, Your Honor. Legal and binding." The judge removed his spectacles, surveying the packed room. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find Sarah Beth Turner's claim to the water rights valid and enforceable by law." Shouts erupted, cheers mixed with angry protests. The gavel cracked down hard. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Beth noticed the change immediately. Where before there had been sneers, now townspeople nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. Elias wrapped her in his arms. "You stood strong," he whispered. "So proud of you, wife." For the first time since the auction block, Sarah Beth felt truly free. The journey back to their mountain home felt different now. The wagon swayed gently as Elias guided the mule along familiar trails. Sarah Beth's mother's quilt folded carefully between them. Peace settled over the valley like fresh snow. Within days, neighbors began appearing at their cabin door. Morning Star brought seeds and wisdom for planting. White settlers came with shovels and strong backs, ready to dig irrigation channels that would share the stream's blessing. The work was hard, but hearts were willing, knowing the water would flow fair for all. The cabin that had once felt so empty now buzzed with life. Widow Carson's children played in the yard, while she helped Sarah Beth preserve vegetables. 2 orphaned sisters found refuge in the spare room, their laughter brightening morning chores. One evening, as golden lamplight spilled across the wooden table, Sarah Beth ladled venison stew into bowls. The room was full, Morning Star sharing stories, the widow mending clothes, children playing quietly in the corner. Elias reached across the table and took her hand, his voice soft with love. "That silver dollar was the best trade I ever made." Sarah Beth squeezed his fingers, her heart overflowing. The frightened girl from the auction block was gone. In her place stood a woman surrounded by family, her worth measured not in coins, but in the community that had bloomed around her like spring flowers. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.